In this webinar, we will 1. Identify and explore English as a lingua franca, ELF. 2, we'll discuss techniques to remember and points to ponder, and that's where we'll look at some practical classroom activities and ideas and some things to think about. And 3, we'll share ideas, activities and tips. And in that final section is where I'd like to invite you to share your ideas through a Padlet and help our teacher community. Also, I just want to say I'm aware that I don't know your classes, of course, or the specifics of your teaching context, but I hope there'll be something in here for everyone, and I hope we'll have a really productive and fun session. So let's go. First up then, number 1, identify and explore ELF. So what exactly is ELF? And we do love our acronyms in ELT, don't we? I particularly love them, and you'll find out how much I love them in a minute. But let's look at these descriptors of English learning. And this is not a complete list, of course, just a few examples. So at the top, we've got English for academic purposes. So preparing students for tertiary education or IELTS. We've got English as a foreign language. So preparing students to communicate with L1 English speakers. We've got EIL, English as an international language. I feel that that's a slightly older term now, but I also feel it's a bit of a predecessor for ELF. And here is ELF, English as a lingua franca. We'll look at a precise definition in a second. ELT, English language teaching, of course. ESL, English as a second language. And ESOL, ESOL, English for speakers of other languages. So ESOL and ESOL, both of those are for people not from an English-speaking country, but who are now living in an English-speaking country and are communicating with L1 English speakers. ESP at the bottom there is English for specific purposes. So learning English for a specific industry or profession, so such as aviation or medicine, something like that. Let's look at getting a better definition for ELF. So ELF is the English as the language of communication between people with different L1s. And as Rodrigo said a moment ago, this is exactly what we're doing today. We've all got different L1s, but we're all communicating with each other through one common language, English. And whereas ELT historically may have been more about preparing students to communicate with L1 English speakers, today in 23, it's much more about preparing students to communicate with other English users whose L1 is not English. And it may well be that your students still interact with L1 English speakers, yes, of course, but they're likely to be in the minority. And we can see ELF everywhere in this little list at the bottom of the slide. So it's the language of education, the language of entertainment, the language of the internet. It's the language of the online world, right? We're using English right now, and we're going to come back to online later. It's the language of media. It's the language of officialdom, so governments, rules, diplomacy. English is the official language of 75 countries around the world. It's also a pluricentric language, so it's a language which has official status shared by at least 2 countries. And some other examples of that, there's Arabic, there's Greek, Korean, Portuguese, Urdu, and so on. So it's time for a question for you, if that's okay. So the question is, what percentage of English speakers are not L1 English speakers? And as it's Valentine's Day, you've got a little row of hearts there, which might be able to help you with your guesswork and a percentage. How many do you think? So I'm just looking at the chat box. We've got 75%, 60%, 95, 70, 80, a lot. I agree with that one. Excuse me. Yep, so I think the hearts worked well there. That's a good cue for you. So let me just confirm then that greater than 80% of English speakers are not L1 English speakers. For me, these statistics are always really powerful and a really great reminder of the world in which we live in and how English is being used. You can see those extra statistics at the bottom of the slide. So there's around 1.5 billion English users in the world. Out of that 1.5 billion, we've got around 375 million L1 speakers. So pretty low compared to around 1.2 billion L2 speakers. And here we are now, as I say, an example of that. Could I ask you very quickly, what's your first language? Could you write it in the chat box? We can do a little, not very scientific experiment to see if that 80% is right. Oh, there's loads. Oh, I saw one English. So many different languages, and English is not featuring there at all. So that's interesting. That's great. So we are indeed a perfect example of that statistic. Thank you. Thanks for your answers. There was some very speedy typing. You're all very good. Well done. Fantastic. Let's move on to our next section then, section 2. So discussing techniques to remember and points to ponder. So I mentioned at the beginning that we do love acronyms in ELT, and I'm a big fan of an acronym. And if you've been to one of my webinars before, you'll know that I like to use an acronym to sort of describe the skills and the tips for that topic. So today's acronym, it's got to be global. We're at the Global Teachers Festival. We're talking about a global language and working in a global context. So can you guess what this first word might be? Can you fill in the gaps? There's a picture there to help you. Oh, there's been a successful guest already. Yeah, so the guesses are all correct. The guesses are indeed guessed. And you're all guests here today at the Global Teachers Festival, just as our students are guests in our lessons. And I'm deliberately using that word guests because my feeling is that we want our students to feel like guests. We want them to be welcomed into our classrooms and to have a really positive experience when they're there. And when your students are out the classroom and when they're working in their international environments, they will be a guest in another culture, or they may be receiving guests from another culture. And thinking about culture, let's look at a quick definition of the meaning of culture. So culture is a set of ideas, beliefs, and recognizable ways of behaving of a particular organization or a group of people. Yeah, because it's not just confined to a country, of course. There's a culture of a region within a country, a company, a club, or a global teachers festival. One of the reasons I love being part of this festival is because of the culture. It's welcoming, it's positive, it's inclusive, it's about sharing and learning. So your students are going to experience some form of culture in whatever work environment they're in currently or they aspire to be in. So also we need to say what culture isn't, and culture isn't just a do and don't list or the 5 Fs. So a do and don't list, that's super easy to Google, right? Or use ChatGPT and you'll get a list of things to do and not to do when you're in other cultures. And that's fine, yeah, as far as it goes. But the trouble is it doesn't actually go that far. By its very nature, it's going to be superficial and it's going to be limited. So in that list, there might be some broad assumptions, some stereotypes, perhaps some unconscious bias. It might be a bit negative. It's probably going to be inaccurate. It just doesn't do justice to all the individual differences within that group. And we know as teachers that individual differences are always present, always important, and we want inclusivity in our lessons. The other thing culture isn't just, and that's the 5 Fs. So food, fashion, famous people, festivals, and flags. It's something we often see in course books. It's something I'm often asked to write about as well. And there is a valid reason for that, because a course book is going to be used across many different countries, many different cultures, and perhaps there's not always the opportunity to drill down into a particular culture. So it's not an easy balance to get right. It's time for another question for you. And this question is, which skills do guests need for international work environments? 1, 2, 3, or 4? What do you think? It could be 1, intercultural skills, ability to comprehend different cultures and viewpoints. Interpersonal skills, ability to build positive relationships and interact positively. Looks like there's lots of 2s and 3s in the answers at the moment. 3, communication skills. So that ability to express your ideas and to convey information or opinions. Lots of people saying all of them. So that means critical thinking skills is also included, not necessarily Bloom and lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills. It could just be thinking critically and strategically. So yeah, a mix of answers. There's quite a lot of people saying all, and I think I'd probably say all. because there's a lot of overlap between these skills. There's cognitive skills, behavioural skills, linguistic skills, and I think all of them, for me, would be useful in international work environments. Let's drill down a little bit deeper and look at some shared sub-skills amongst those 4 skills. Let me show you a few examples. And we've got a heart for you for Valentine's Day. So here are some sub-skills. We've got active listening, self-awareness, diplomacy, empathy, inclusivity, kindness. Can you add some more to the list? Could you use the chat box and give me some other examples of useful sub-skills? What do you think? Caring, yes, thank you, Roseanne, that's great. Acceptance, that's lovely, Halima. Yeah, I like that. Being attention, sorry. Flexibility, tolerance, compassion, mindfulness, that's a great one. Tolerance, oh, there's so many answers, they're very quick. Empathy, tolerance, being inquisitive, yeah, that's a great one. Resilient, loyal, yeah, lovely. Caring, patience, respect, reciprocal, yes. Inclusion, curiosity, all of yes, I agree with all of them. Yes, they're all fantastic ideas. Brilliant, yeah. Using your imagination, yeah, definitely. Love, absolutely. Perfect word for today, isn't it? Lovely. Thank you so much for your suggestions there. Yes, fantastic. I also wanted to mention that whilst we're talking about an international work environment today, all of these sub-skills here in the heart and all the ones that you're mentioning in the chat box, they're important for all students, in my opinion. So if you're introducing these sub-skills to young learners, that would be great. To teenagers, that would also be great, because it's getting that growth mindset and that all-important empathy into the culture of your lessons. And for me, empathy is an absolute fundamental quality for a teacher. I also want to mention a really lovely little linguistic theory, and this is communication accommodation theory from Giles in 1971. Now, there have been a number of developments of the theory since then, which include verbal and non-verbal communication, but this is the starting point. And the theory posits that people adjust or accommodate for their guests their spoken communication to become more or less like others. If it becomes more like others, that's convergence. So there's that coming together, because there's a desire to accommodate that speaker, because they're your guest. We want them to feel listened to, we want them to like us, or we could simply just want that interaction to be successful and easy. Very inclusive, it's very positive. The other side, away from convergence, is divergence. So that's less like others, the opposite, a desire to demonstrate a difference between yourself and others. It might be to assert authority or superiority, to gain control of the interaction. It's not inclusive, and obviously it's quite a negative experience. And I don't know about you, I've certainly experienced communications that have had an element of divergence in them, and it's not very pleasant. It's not a conversation you want to continue with, because the other person clearly doesn't want it to continue. It's a very negative experience, and it makes you feel awful. If we flip that though, and we think of interactions where people have been friendly, kind, warm, smiling, they're actively seeking to ask you questions, to listen to what you're saying, to listen actively, to build that relationship, that feels great, doesn't it? And the reason I wanted to include this theory, 2 reasons really, that I find it really interesting. One, it just reminds me so much of our role as teachers and the power that we really do have to make our students feel welcome and valued and safe in our class as our guests. We want to build that rapport. We want it to be positive. And secondly, as teachers, we can model this convergence behavior to be positive and inclusive in every single lesson we give. So then your students can replicate that behavior in the class and maybe outside of the class and in their life. A little goes a long way, I think. It's worth remembering that. Another way of accommodating our guests is using communication techniques. A lot of you mentioned some ideas about that in the sub-skills section we just spoke about. So let's look at some examples of communication techniques. So, adapting language. This is from a section called Mediation Confident Communicator from Speak Your Mind. I'm one of the co-authors of that course. And this is a really cool little feature in the course, Confident Communicator. And it's those exact words. It's how we want our students to feel, that they're confident when they can communicate. They're easily prepared to converse in all the different international work environments that they will be in. So this example shows 3 ways of adapting language, A, B, and C, there on the right. We've got A, simplifying, B, explaining, C, giving examples. And this is presented to the students through a conversation with examples of these 3 techniques. So could you, with your classes, perhaps find a conversation, written, spoken, video, or one you've created, and examine these techniques or similar ones with your students? Another example, interpersonal effectiveness. This is from a Skills for Pros feature, again from Speak Your Mind. It's a really lovely feature, and that explores different communication skills for international work environments. This particular one, as we've said, looks at interpersonal effectiveness. So there's a text there, a short reading text, which describes what the skill is. And that box overlaying the top of the text with 6 tick boxes there, that's a little comprehension check of the text, and it's also a checklist for what interpersonal effectiveness means. So could you perhaps choose one of those skills of interpersonal skills, the sub-skills you mentioned earlier, is the one that you really like, that you could choose, research, and discuss a bit further with your class, and maybe draw up a checklist? Another example, translating for formal communication. So I wanted to include this one because we often have mixed abilities in our classes. That's a reality, right? And it is a bit of a challenge to teach a mixed ability class. And just as we have mixed ability in our class, you know, I think it's good to remember that we have mixed ability within an ELF situation too. Not everyone's going to be the same level. So even if all your students are tested at B1 level, or everyone declares themselves at a particular level, there will still be differences, strengths and weaknesses amongst that group, because, hey, there are individual differences. So focusing on something like this, translating and helping, would be a really great communicative skill for our guests. So maybe you could give some English phrases to your students to translate to each other, or if you're in a monolingual class with a shared L1, maybe you could use that and translate into English. The final example we'll look at for this section is managing a difficult conversation. This is another example of the confident communicator feature. So encouraging our students to communicate with confidence, with ease. And this one, looking at managing a difficult conversation, it gives an example of a conversation, and it pulls out some really useful language in there. And you can see in that box over the top, there are 3 categories there. We've got asking for an explanation of the situation, summarizing the situation, and inviting suggestions for solutions. And then we've got a few exponents of each of those as examples. So this is something you could do with your students as a role play, perhaps. Let's move on to our next letter. And we've done guest, so we're now on L of global. What could this word be? Halima's in there, super quick. Yep, lots of lovely guesses and lots of lovely correct guesses. Thank you very much, everyone. It is indeed language. And we've got lots of different examples here of international different languages. Today, though, in this section, I'd like to look at target language. So by that, I mean the language that we've made a conscious and deliberate decision to present and teach to our students. And I should also say I'm a big fan of emergent language, so the incidental language that arises naturally and spontaneously through interactions, which we can then use as learning opportunities in the lesson. But that area needs a whole webinar or course to itself. So that's not for today. Let's concentrate on the target language today and look at some examples of useful language you can include for your students. First one, here we go. So this is a nice little article. You can see it's a super simple gap fill. That's it. And it's a little article about a winner of the global, that word again, the Global Teacher Prize. It's a nice gap fill, practicing some grammar, working on the past perfect simple and the past perfect progressive. And I've included this one. It's nothing exciting or dramatic, but I've included it because, for that very reason, because we want our students to still have the language to communicate. It's not just about those communicative skills, it's also about the grammar and the vocab. Your students will still need this breadth of grammar and lexis in order to communicate. It's as simple as that, really. So if you feel that your students need to focus in on a particular piece of grammar, or you need to present something new, go for it, use it, present it. Our next example is an example of target language that deals directly with communication skills. And again, it's looking at interpersonal skills. So this is vocabulary for interpersonal phrases. So we spoke about interpersonal skills earlier, and here we've got some lectures that picks up on that very topic. We've got eye contact, to convey, face-to-face, and so on. And it's a very simple matching exercise, that's all. We've got the contextualized phrases at the top of the slide there, and then the definitions that students match to at the bottom of the slide. So just as I mentioned, not to neglect the grammar, the same goes for the lexes. If you need to introduce some new language to your students, particularly on a subject like a communication skill, go for it. Give them the language that they need to do just that. And it's not just grammar and vocab that we need to include, it's also pronunciation. So this is a really nice example of a pronunciation point which I think is less daunting than other pronunciation points to teach. And it's also a really important one. It looks quite simple, but I think that's deceptive because we need to have our students expressing themselves and conveying their meaning with accuracy, particularly when they're dealing in an ELF situation. So contrastive stress is the focus of this exercise. And if you look at the very bottom line there, line B in blue, no, we don't live in Peru, we live in Chile. We've just got that contrastive stress to show the correct information. Let's move on to our next letter. We've looked at G for guest, L for language, and now it's O for, what do you think? Online, I think, Suye, were you in there first? I think so. Right, lovely. Thank you. Fast fingers again today. Thank you, everyone. So at the beginning, when we were talking about ELF, we mentioned that English is the language of the internet. So we're going to look at English online for work situations. If you do want to look more at teaching online and motivating students specifically, then have another webinar that I did with Macmillan on that topic, and I'll give you the link for that later. Here today, though, let's look at online work situations. And all these icons here in a work situation, they're all going to be using reading and writing short pieces of text. And yes, you can have longer and more formal emails, absolutely, of course, but let's concentrate on the smaller ones and look at some characteristics that unites them. So, characteristics of online written communication. They're short and snappy, omnipresent, because it's everywhere, isn't it? Online and in all those different social channels. And we're contactable 24 hours of every day, unless we switch off our phone, which I'm not very good at doing myself. Purposeful. So people are communicating with a purpose, to set up a meeting, to introduce ourselves to new contacts, to present a new idea, to make a request. We might just be having a chat, and don't underestimate that. It's one of my favorites. But we also know from thinking about interpersonal skills that building a rapport, building a relationship is important. So don't underestimate just having a chat. It's semi-spontaneous. So for me, these types of online written communication are a lot less planned than those longer formal emails. And it's more casual. For me, it feels a lot less formal. Let's have a look at an example of one. So this is an online conversation between two colleagues. It's an example that shows a few of those characteristics we just mentioned. So it's short and snappy. You see those short lines there in the different parts of the conversation. It's purposeful. The purpose is to find out about a hotel that one of the speakers is staying at, and it's quite casual and chatty. It also shows on that page the need for basic language input, which we spoke about earlier. Now, this is from starter level, so it's very much for students at the beginning of their language learning journey. So it looks at basic writing skills, the use of punctuation, short subject, verb, object sentences. And there's also a neat little activity at the bottom there called Make It Digital, to send 2 text messages to different classmates in English. So students are practicing their online digital skills as well as English. Perfect preparation for an online work environment. What other activities can you do with your students? Well, some of these might be nice to try, and they're in order from easy-ish to huge at the bottom. So starting at the top, You could do a little written role play, sending instant messages, like the example we just looked at. You could ask your students to write a social media post. You could have them respond to a job advert. So could you find a job advert and show it to your students and ask them to respond? Could they create a poster or an advertisement for something related to their work? Could they research and edit some written work? Maybe you could use ChatGPT for that and make the text even better. Could you get your students to set up a LinkedIn profile? And I'm on LinkedIn, so do say hello to me there. And the big one, the biggest one as well, that creating a website. So that might be something, because it's so big, it's maybe project-based, and you might want to do that over a number of weeks with your class. It may be appropriate for some contexts. And amongst all of this talk about writing, hand in hand with writing is, of course, the skill of reading. And we mentioned active listening back a while ago as a sub-skill for students. So how about active reading? I'd encourage you to think about that as well. And it's just like active listening in that we're observing the other person's style and mirroring and encouraging that. So in written communication, you can ask your students to think about how someone has written to them. What salutation did they use? Did they use dear? Did they say hi? How did they use their own name? How did they choose to use it? In its full form, Thomas, in a short form, Tom, Tommy, or Mr. Green, more formal. And what's the general formality or register? What's the language and tone of that communication? What's the length? Is it short? Is it long? Did they use emojis? I am a huge fan of emojis. I like using them, but I don't think I ever really use them until I've received a message with an emoji in, and then I release all of my emojis proudly and happily. And then last but by no means least, their response, because it's an ongoing thing, active reading. So we want to keep making sure that we're listening actively to the formality, the use of emojis, the name choice. We want to make sure we're still dealing correctly, respectfully with the person. It's time for our next letter. And it's B for, what do you think? Balance, I think, who's in there first? Alina, maybe? Okay, it is indeed B for balance. Thank you, lovely. And I've got two questions for you to ponder here. So these aren't for you to answer now in the chat box, just to think about at your leisure later. So to ponder, are we providing enough balance of strategic competence and linguistic competence? So we absolutely want that strategic competence, those 4 communication skills we looked at in G for guest, intercultural skills, interpersonal skills, communication skills, critical thinking skills. And for that balance, we want the linguistic competence too. So we want all those basic language skills that we looked at in L for language and just now in O for online. The second question to ponder, are we reflecting enough on our own teaching practice? And this can be as small or as large as you want. It could be as simple as a few minutes reflecting on a lesson afterwards, what went well, what could be improved. I'm going to do that after this webinar. It could be trying a whole new lesson model in your classroom, maybe trying to work with emergent language, for example. It could be helping other colleagues, sharing a lesson plan, sharing an idea, or doing peer observation. It's whatever you want it to be. Time for our next letter, and it is A for there's some good pronunciation fans out here. I'm a bit of a phonology geek, so it's lovely to see I'm not alone. That's brilliant. Thank you, everyone. And perfect spelling and typing. So it is indeed accent. So we've just looked at writing skills in the online section. So let's now look at the other output skill, speaking. And let's return to ELF. And hey, here's another acronym, the LFC, Lingua, Franca, Core. And this is such an easy area that we can recognize and utilize in our teaching right now. So the Lingua Franca Core was born out of research from the classroom. This is found by Jenkins in 2000. I'll give you the reference for that later on. And this research was done into how L2 speakers in multilingual classes, we're using English. So it's firmly rooted in the classroom, which is fantastic, I think. So the pronunciation features of intelligible EFL output are, and let me quickly point out that we're looking at intelligible output, comprehensible, that's it. So the 4 features are vowel length. So we've got the short vowels, I, E. We've got the long vowels, E, U, and we've got the diphthong, A. Most consonants are also important. Consonant clusters, like these ones shown in global, the G and the L, and in teacher, the C and the H, and word grouping and nuclear stress. So 4 very interesting, useful features of intelligible EFL output. And what I like about this is that it goes from the small to the large. So it goes down into the segmental work. It looks at individual sounds or phonemes, those vowels, I, E, U, E, A. It looks at those segments, and it goes up to the supra-segmental level. So the melody of our speech, the rhythm, the pitch, and the intonation, that's picked up in word grouping and nuclear stress. Another thing I find quite interesting about looking at those individual sounds is that if you also teach very young learners, and you're used to teaching with phonics, think about that segmenting and blending work. That's super important for those children. So it's blending a consonant, a vowel, and a consonant. K, A, T, cat, to get that initial familiarization between word and sound and developing the vocabulary. It's so important in every area of English. And the nuclear stress, the one right at the bottom, just to point out, that simply means the most prominent stressed word in a tone group. So that could be for emphasis, or it could be for contrast. And we've actually already seen an example of this when we looked at the pronunciation example. Do you remember no, we don't live in Peru, we live in Chile. It's that simple. So all of these are great features that are recognizable in your teaching and easy to teach. And do we need to teach them? Why bother? Well, yes, absolutely, because the LFC helps to raise awareness of the ELF context in working environments. It prepares students for real-life English interactions. It reminds students of the dominance of L2 speakers. It encourages students to reflect on spoken output, and it promotes inclusivity and personal identity. And I think this final point is probably my favorite, because the Lingua Franca core is about intelligibility. As I said, it's not about pushing students towards a particular target sound that's either right or wrong. It really allows students to maintain their own voice, like literally maintain their own voice, and their accent and their identity. So some more questions for you to ponder now. So what do students think of accents, theirs or others? Could 80% of your pronunciation activities in class focus on the LFC? Could 20% of your pronunciation activities focus on other areas outside of the LFC? And why am I saying 80% and 20%? That's because that statistic right at the beginning we looked at, that more than 80% of English users are L2 English speakers. So we want to replicate that in our classroom and prepare our students for the real world that they will be communicating in and working in internationally. And 20% of pronunciation activities from other areas, that's everything that you're probably already doing. So things like contrastive stress that we looked at, word stress, maybe minimal pairs work, syllable stress, individual sounds, all of those would be great. And intonation, so important to pick up that supra-segmental work, phonology. So we are moving on to our final letter. We've done guest, language, online, balance, accents. So our final one is L for, oh, and there's a little heart for you, some linguistic love. What is the missing word? And I think Annie maybe was first in there. Thank you very much. Love should be in there, shouldn't it? But doesn't quite fit. So It's learn is the answer here. And I think I've included this simply because we are always learning as teachers, as students, as humans. We said earlier about that importance of developing all those sub skills and developing that growth mindset. So in this final section, I'd love to learn about your thoughts and your ideas about ELF and your experiences and how you're preparing your students for international working environments. I know from the chat box, you're going to have loads of fantastic ideas. So here's that final invitation I mentioned. Share ideas, activities, and tips. So this final section is yours and your chance to share with all of our friends in the teaching community. But how? Allow me to tell you. You can do this two ways. So one, you could share this webinar or some ideas from it with your colleagues. If you're doing that online, then do tag me on LinkedIn. I'd love to see. And or would you like to collaborate in a Padlet? So there's the QR code for you there on the screen to take a picture of, or there's the address, and that's padlet.com/Rhona Snelling /global. And also on that Padlet, there are the references I mentioned to you from today. So there's some further reading around ELF, some great books from Jennifer Jenkins. There's some links to some corpora if you wanted to explore vocabulary a little bit more there. And because it's Valentine's Day and I want you to have a nice gift, there's a little lesson plan there on accents. And the final thing to ask you, our acronym today was global. So can I ask you, what did the G stand for? Guest, I think, Shari, you were in there first. Guest, thank you. We had guest, then we had L for, what did L stand for? Language, and I missed your name. Thank you, whoever was in there, super quick. So guest, language. O was online. Yes, thank you. Guest, language, online. B was balance. Such fast typing, amazing. A, we've just looked at, that's a super easy one, isn't it? Accent, lovely. And then the final letter L, learn. Super, thank you so much. Lovely. So I will just say a huge thank you very much for sharing your time with me today. Thank you for all your amazing participation and enthusiasm and busyness in the chat box. That's been brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for taking part so actively. If you'd like to join the Padlet, please do. There's the address again for you. Or if you want to say hello to me, please do. That would also be lovely. And I will hand you back to Rodrigo now and stop sharing my screen. Thank you, everyone, again. Hi.
Thank you, Rhona, for this amazing talk. It's so insightful. There are so many interesting details we need to pay attention to, right? Sometimes they look like they're small details, but they tend to have a huge impact,
oh my God,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Great. Well, we have a few questions.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question from Facebook by Zakir Ullah. What is the difference between English as an international language and English as a global language?
I think the short answer is very little. I've not heard it described English as a global, EGL. So that's not an acronym I'm familiar with, but I'd say they're the same. And as I mentioned earlier, for me, EIL is a bit of an older term now. I don't hear it around as much compared to in the past. So it's probably been usurped now by ELF or maybe English as a global language.
Amazing. I think there's time for another one. Could you please throw some light on ELF as a tool for language assessment?
Oh, for language assessment. Well, I think then you've got to root your assessment completely in L2 speakers. So you're not looking at any L1 models. You're looking at that. It's probably using that Lingua Franca core to look at the speaking assessments, that you've got the intelligibility of those vowel sounds of the segments, and you've got that comprehensibility in the super segmental sounds. And you want to also include some of that vocabulary we looked at, like the interpersonal phrases, picking up on some of those. So I think it's the best way to approach assessment, thinking what it is you want to assess, and then seeing if your students are able to deliver that. And if not, then what can you do to push them towards that correct language, that useful language.
Very interesting. Yeah. And lots of food for thought, right? Throughout your talk. I bet there were many eureka moments for lots of the viewers here with us, like, that makes total sense, or so amazing contributions as always, Rhona. Thank you very, very much.
My absolute pleasure.
And audience, as Rhona showed in her session, it is crucial to teach young adult learners the communication and language skills that will help them succeed in international working environments, right? Speak Your Mind offers young adult learners everything they need to thrive in their future professional careers. The course gives students plenty of opportunities to practice communication skills whilst learning how to solve problems, make plans and decisions, and express their point of view clearly and confident. Special Follow-Up Pro and Skills for Pros material includes real-life videos that make students familiar with the specifics of different jobs and equip students with necessary language skills. So you can discover all amazing features of Speak Your Mind, authored by the amazing Rhona Snelling, and try and test the course with the students by downloading sample units at macmillanenglish.com/Speak Your Mind.